What time is it right now? You probably know, right? Exactly, even up to the last second. But for most of human history, no one did. Not farmers, not merchants, not even kings. They didn't know if it was 2:47 or 3:15. They didn't have words for those numbers. And for thousands of years, it didn't matter. Welcome to Hours Forgotten. I'm glad you're here. This is the story of how humans measured time before clocks, how societies functioned without exact hours, and what we lost when we gained precision. If you're curious about how daily life actually worked in the past, the strange, the practical, the forgotten, you're in the right place. Subscribe if you'd like. There's no rush. Let's go back to a world where time moved differently. In medieval Europe, time didn't belong to individuals. It belonged to God, and therefore to the church. The day was divided not by hours, but by prayers. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sixth, none, vespers, compline. 8 prayer times. 8 moments when bells rang across every town and village. That was time. Not 3 p.m., not 5:15, just the bells for none, the bells for vespers. And if you were a peasant working in the fields or a merchant traveling between towns, you oriented your day around those sounds. When the bells rang for prime, around what we'd call 6 a.m., you knew the day had begun. When none rang, around 3 p.m., you knew afternoon work was underway. When compline sounded at dusk, you knew the day was ending. But here's what's strange to us now. No one thought about the time between the bells. If it was, let's say, 2 hours after terce, but not yet sixth, there was no name for that moment. You were simply between prayers, and that was enough. The church bells served another purpose, too. They regulated labor. Monastic communities, the monks and nuns who lived by strict schedules, needed to coordinate their days. Prayer at specific intervals, meals at specific times, work periods, rest periods. So monasteries developed elaborate timekeeping systems. Not clocks, not yet, but markers. Candles marked with lines. When the wax burned to the 3rd line, it was time for prayer. Water clocks, vessels with small holes that drained slowly. When the water reached a certain level, a bell was triggered. Hourglasses filled with sand. These weren't precise. A candle might burn faster on a windy day, a water clock might freeze in winter, but they were consistent enough for monastic life. And that consistency, that rhythm, spread beyond monastery walls. Because the bells rang for everyone. Peasants working in the fields heard them, merchants in the market heard them, nobles in their estates heard them. And slowly, over centuries, European society synchronized itself to the sound of church bells. Not to minutes, not to seconds, but to a shared rhythm of prayer. But outside the church, time was even more fluid. Farmers didn't work by the hour. They worked by the sun. You woke when it was light enough to see. You worked until it was too dark to continue. You ate when you were hungry and when food was ready. In summer, the workday was long, 14, 15, 16 hours of daylight. In winter, it was short, maybe 8 or 9 hours. There was no concept of a 9 to 5, no standardized workday. Your relationship with time depended entirely on the season, on the weather, on the task at hand. If you were a blacksmith and someone needed a horseshoe urgently, you worked until it was done. If you were a baker and the bread needed to rise, you waited, however long that took. Time wasn't something you fought against. It was something you moved with. And here's the remarkable thing. This system worked. For thousands of years, it worked. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires were built. Art was created. Philosophy was written. Trade flourished. All without anyone knowing the exact minute. So if you needed to coordinate with someone, if you wanted to meet a friend or conduct business, how did you do it? You used natural markers. The most basic was the sun's position. If someone said, "Meet me when the sun is halfway to its peak," you knew roughly when that was. Not 11:30 a.m., but mid-morning, the third or fourth hour after sunrise. If they said, "Meet me when shadows are longest," that meant early morning or late afternoon. If they said, "When the sun is directly overhead," that was noon, midday, the only moment of the day that had a clear, universal marker. Sundials made this more precise. A simple stick in the ground, called a gnomon, cast a shadow. As the sun moved across the sky, the shadow moved too. If you marked where the shadow fell at regular intervals, you could create a rough clock. But sundials had problems. They didn't work on cloudy days. They didn't work at night, and they didn't account for the fact that the sun's path changes with the seasons. A shadow that fell at a certain angle in June would fall at a different angle in December, even at the same time of day. So sundials were useful, but not reliable enough for precision. For most people, time was measured by tasks. You didn't say, "I'll finish this in 3 hours." You said, "I'll finish this by the time the bread rises," or before the next bell. Lawyers in medieval England were paid by the hour, but that didn't mean 60 minutes. It meant 1/12 of the daylight period. So in summer, an hour might be 75 minutes long. In winter, it might be 45 minutes. These were temporal hours, and they changed every single day. This seems impossibly confusing to us now, but to medieval people, it made perfect sense, because the goal wasn't precision, it was rhythm. You didn't need to know it was exactly 4:23 p.m. You needed to know it was late afternoon. The workday was winding down, and vespers would ring soon. That was enough. Markets operated this way too. A market might be held from sunrise to the noon bell. Everyone understood that. No one needed a watch. Court sessions began when the judge arrives and ended when the business is done. Meals happened when the food is ready. The entire structure of daily life was built on rough coordination and shared understanding, not mechanical precision. At night, time became even more approximate. Some people used the stars. If you knew which constellations rose at which times of year, you could estimate the hour. The moon's position helped too. A full moon rising just after sunset meant it was early evening. A moon high in the sky meant midnight had passed. But most people simply divided the night into watches. First watch, middle watch, last watch. 3 rough periods between sunset and sunrise. If you were a city guard and you worked the middle watch, you knew you'd be on duty during the deepest part of the night. Exactly when that started or ended, it didn't matter. Some cultures used even simpler methods. In China, incense clocks were common. Specially made incense sticks burned at predictable rates. When a certain length had burned, you knew time had passed. In India, some temples used the time it took to recite certain prayers as a measurement. In parts of Africa, people measured time by how long it took to cook rice. Every culture developed their own system, and every system was good enough for the life they lived. Animals helped too. Roosters crowed at dawn. Every farmer knew that sound meant morning had arrived. But here's something interesting. Roosters don't crow at exactly the same time every day. They respond to light levels, to temperature, to the season. So rooster crow wasn't 6 a.m. It was whenever dawn breaks, which changes throughout the year. And that was fine, because the goal wasn't to wake up at a specific minute. It was to wake up when daylight made work possible. This might sound chaotic to us now, but it was actually deeply connected to natural rhythms. Your body woke with the sun, you worked with daylight, you rested when darkness came. There was no alarm clock jolting you awake before your body was ready. No racing against a ticking clock to meet a deadline. Time flowed. You flowed with it. But then something changed. In the late 1200s, European cities began installing mechanical clocks. These weren't small timepieces you could carry. They were massive machines, built into church towers, powered by weights and gears. They were expensive, difficult to maintain, and not particularly accurate by modern standards. A medieval tower clock might drift by 15 or 20 minutes a day, but for the first time in human history, time could be measured consistently, independent of the sun, independent of the seasons. The first public mechanical clock was installed in Milan in 1335, then Strasbourg in 1354, then across Europe. And slowly, a new concept emerged: the hour. Not a temporal hour that changed with the seasons, but a fixed hour. 60 minutes, every time, all year round. This was revolutionary. At first, most people ignored the clocks. Peasants in the countryside continued living by the sun. Why would they care about a mechanical device in a distant town? But in cities, clocks began to matter. Merchants needed to coordinate. If you're trading with someone from another town, you can't just say, around midday. Which midday? Yours or mine? The sun reaches its peak at slightly different times in different locations. Mechanical clocks provided a standard. Guilds, professional organizations of craftsmen, began using clocks to regulate work hours. You worked from the first hour to the 9th hour, defined by the clock, not by the sun. This was the beginning of shift work, of standardized schedules, of the idea that time itself was something that could be bought and sold. Because if you're paying workers by the hour, those hours need to be the same length every day. Temporal hours wouldn't work anymore. You needed mechanical hours. But the biggest change came with long-distance travel. Ships needed accurate time to calculate longitude. If you're sailing across the ocean, knowing your latitude, how far north or south you are, is easy. You measure the sun's angle at noon. But longitude, how far east or west, requires knowing the exact time. You compare local noon, when the sun is highest, with the time on a clock set to your departure port. The difference tells you how far you've traveled east or west. But this only works if your clock is accurate. In the 1700s, clockmakers began building marine chronometers. Clocks so precise they could keep time on a rocking ship for months. These devices changed navigation forever. Suddenly, ships could cross oceans with confidence. Trade expanded, empires grew, all because of precise timekeeping. And then came the railroads. In the 1800s, trains made long-distance travel fast and frequent. But every town had its own local time, based on when the sun was highest in their sky. Boston's noon was different from New York's noon by several minutes. Philadelphia's was different still. This created chaos. Train schedules became impossible to coordinate. Crashes happened because two trains thought they were on time according to different clocks. So, in 1883, railroads imposed standard time zones. Suddenly, everyone in the Eastern Zone had the same time. Everyone in the Central Zone had the same time. It didn't matter what the sun was doing. The clock said 3 p.m., so it was 3 p.m. This was deeply controversial. Farmers protested. God's time versus railroad time, they called it. But the railroads won, and by 1900, nearly everyone in the industrialized world lived by mechanical time. Exact, standardized, divorced from the sun. So we gained precision. We gained coordination. We gained efficiency. But what did we lose? We lost rhythm. Medieval people lived in sync with natural cycles. Their bodies woke with light, rested with darkness. We live in sync with alarm clocks. We force ourselves awake when it's still dark. We stay awake long after sunset. We fight our biology every single day. We lost flexibility. If a medieval baker needed an extra hour for dough to rise, they waited. The bread was ready when it was ready. Now, though, if you're late to work by 10 minutes, there are consequences. Time became a commodity, something you spend, something you waste, something you're always running out of. I don't have time. That took too much time. Time is money. These phrases would have been meaningless to a medieval farmer. We lost presence. When you don't know the exact minute, you pay attention to where you are, to what you're doing. Now, we check our phones constantly, counting down until the next appointment, the next deadline. We're rarely fully here. There's research on this. Studies show that people in societies without rigid time structures report lower stress levels. They sleep better, they have fewer anxiety disorders, not because their lives are easier, but because they're not fighting the clock. They're living with time, not against it. Of course, we can't go back. Modern society requires coordination. Air traffic control needs precision. Surgery needs precision. International business needs precision. But maybe we can remember that for most of human history, precision wasn't necessary. And in our personal lives, in our daily rhythms, maybe it still isn't. There's a reason taking your time is associated with quality. A reason we talk about slow food and slow living as ideals. Because deep down, we remember. We remember that good things often can't be rushed, that bread rises when it's ready, that conversations unfold at their own pace, that creativity emerges in unstructured time. Medieval people knew this instinctively. They lived it every day, not because they were wise or enlightened, but because they didn't have a choice. The clock hadn't been invented yet, and in its absence, they found a different relationship with time. One that flowed, one that bent, one that made room for the rhythms of life itself. Today, we carry the most accurate timekeeping devices in human history. In our pockets, your smartphone syncs with atomic clocks. It's accurate to nanoseconds. You know exactly what time it is, anywhere on Earth, any moment. And yet, we're more stressed about time than ever before. We schedule our days down to 15-minute blocks. We track our hours. We optimize our routines. We have more control over time than any generation in history. And somehow, we feel like we have less. Maybe that's because time isn't something that can be controlled. Not really. The sun rises when it rises. The seasons change when they change. Your body has rhythms that don't care about your calendar. For thousands of years, humans accepted this. They worked with time. They flowed with it. They didn't know the exact hour. And they were fine. So, the next time you check your watch, or glance at your phone, or feel that familiar pressure of time slipping away, remember, for most of human history, no one knew what time it was, and the world kept turning. Until next time, stay curious.